All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. We're beginning now with parallel passages in Kings and Chronicles. We got into a discussion of Kings last week in Chronicles, some overarching viewpoints of the two books. But tonight we're going to get into the parallel passages. So if you want to go ahead and turn, and if you've got two translations, if you've got two Bibles with you, or a paper Bible and a electronic Bible, however you want to do it, I would open up both of them to the passages that we're looking at, so it'd be easier for you to go back and forth. Because remember, Chronicles is concerned about one part of the narrative, and Kings is concerned about another part of the narrative, another viewpoint to the narrative. So we're going to go back and forth. In some of the passages in Kings, it may say more about what's going on than it does in Chronicles, and vice versa. In Chronicles, it may talk more about the issue or the situation that's going on than Kings does. This is more of a narrative rather than, say, the books of prophecy, where it talks about future events and it couches it in figurative language. Kings and Chronicles is pretty much straightforward. There are not to say that there's not prophetic utterances in those two books, but it is more of a linear narrative. What's going on? What's happening with the kingdoms, both northern and southern, when the divided kingdom comes into play. But right now, let's go to 1 Kings chapter 1, verses 2 through 11. Got it right up here. And then 1 Chronicles chapter 28, verse 1 through 29 and verse 30. And these are going to run parallel. All right, the story of these chapters, what we're going to be talking about tonight, at least the first portion of tonight, concerns the last major ministries of David as king of Israel. What's happened so far with David? Well, he's made preparation for the temple. He has fought off one coup attempt. He has subdued the enemies of Israel. He is now receiving tribute and tithes from the various kingdoms that surround him, that they're now vassal states of Israel. It's going to be very sad because in not too distant future, in the relative scheme of things, Israel will be the vassal states of other more powerful nations through God's providence. He allows that to happen. But right now, Israel is riding high. So David is about to give over the kingdom to Solomon, his son. But these chapters that we're going to talk about tonight, these are the last big works of David. As first thing he's going to do, he's going to rescue the throne for Solomon from another coup attempt, and he's going to give a charge to Solomon and the people, by the way, to follow after the Lord. In the books, there's a couple of charts. I encourage you to get the books. If nothing else, you'll have those charts. If you don't, that's fine. If you want them, let me know, and I'll make sure that we get them to you. But if you look at those, and you'll see that the events of the last days of David are recorded in the last part of 1 Chronicles and in the first part of Kings. All right. One thing we need to remember is when we look at the names, okay, names are important, but we need to remember this. Israel, of course, was the name God gave to who? Who did God give the name Israel to? Because he fought with the Lord, right? Okay, he gave the name, he changed Jacob's name to Israel. And of course, we find that earlier on. That's in the days of the patriarchs. But then, as he continues it on, all of the seed of Israel, everything that came out of Jacob or later on Israel, was known as Israel. Okay, so Israel became was not only Jacob, but it also was the people he brought up. So the group of people that he brings up out of Egypt are the Israelites. They are Israel as a people. When he establishes them in the land, they are now a nation, not just a disparate people from various tribes, but they are a nation. And then later on, of course, it is the northern kingdom. But the two kingdoms split. The northern kingdom is known as Israel. And all right, so when we read the word Israel, at least in the context that we're going to read it tonight, it is talking about the nation as a whole. Later on, Israel we refer to, or we'll refer to the northern kingdom. And it also is, there's also another name for it that God gave to it, Ephraim. God gave pet names to his people. One of those was Ephraim. So when there's an exception to that, we'll let everybody know. But right now, when we read the word Israel, we know what this means. So we've got the nation, the kingdom. There we go. All right. So let's read real quick 1 Chronicles chapter 29 very quickly. Let's see. Verse 22. First Chronicles chapter 29 and verse 22. Sure, I get this. Make sure I've got it correct. Chronicles chapter 29 and verse 22. And they ate and drank before the Lord on that day with great gladness. And they made Solomon, the son of David, king the second time. And they anointed him as prince for the Lord, and Zadok as priest. So we need to look at this as there was for Saul and for David and for Solomon. There were two anointings. Remember, there's two ends, not. There were two anointings for Saul, for David, and for Solomon. There was a small, what you would call maybe a small private ceremony for a specific purpose, and then there was a larger, more public, a much more festive anointing and crowning and coronation of David and Saul and Solomon later on. And again, there's a reason for that. And we'll look at the reason that we get into here in just a couple moments. All right. So let's look at, we're not going to read all of it, but I encourage you to go back and read this. So let's look at a little bit of this at the very beginning of First Kings, because that's where we stopped we started getting into last week. All right. In First Kings chapter 1 and verse 1, and it begins with something very dramatic, right? Look at what it says. When King David was very old, what's very old? Well, for the Lord.
There we go. My computer's just very slow here. Okay.
All right. So when David was very old, well, what do we consider very old? What was it that amongst God's people, what would be considered a good old age? It might surprise you, because we're thinking about these longer years that we're living now. What was it then? 70 years was considered to be a good old age. Anything, if you live to be older than that, God was giving you a big blessing to live much past 70 years old. It wasn't that he was artificially hindering them from getting any older. It was just merely that was their life at that time. That was the lifespan that was typically considered to be a good old age. All right.
So when Solomon, who said in Proverbs, I think he said, if a man lives beyond 70, he's done well.
Done very well. Yes. Yeah.
So
that's that idea of wisdom. He knew the physical world at that time. Remember, while God amply blessed them, he did not suspend the laws of human physiology. You worked hard and you labored, and you just the lifespan of a person just wasn't much past about 70 years old. If you live past that, then in their mind, you've done something really good because God has blessed you with more than that. And it's very ironic that he makes that statement, that Solomon makes that statement. We'll see here in just a little bit. So when he was very old, so David's about to the lifespan that he is going to achieve. He's about as far as he's going to go. What's happening here? It says he cannot keep warm even when they put covers over him. Some believe that he was falling prey maybe to one of the many sicknesses that comes along with being older. Don't know if it was something endemic to the physiology of a human being or if it was something that came upon him. But God's blessed him with a good long life. But right at this point, he's not doing so well. He's frail, he's old, and he's a little feeble, but something's about to happen. So his attendant said to him, let's look for a young virgin to serve the king and take care of him. she can lie beside him so that the Lord our king may keep warm. So what's happening here? They are instituting a practice that's been around for years and years and years. This is nothing new. And in many cultures, it still takes place even today. What did they do? They went and found a woman. They searched throughout the land for a beautiful young woman. Hey, if she's going to be doing this and taking care of this sickly old man, she might as well be a beautiful woman for David to enjoy and look at. But they found Abishag, a Shunammite, and brought her to the king. The woman was very beautiful, took care of the king and waited on him, but the king had no sexual relations with her. She was not a concubine. She was not a wife. She was a nurse. She took care of him. She would make sure that his food was prepared. She would make sure that he was bundled up and he was warm. She would lie in the bed with him, even though there was no contact between the two of them. It was, again, a commonplace practice then. And like I said, in some customs, it still is even today. Now, this is what's happening. I believe what they're trying to do is frame this and what's getting ready to happen. Right now, it's showing a picture of David as being a feeble old man. He can't even keep warm. And I know everybody here probably knows at least one older person that seems like they can never get warm. They're chilly all the time. That's why so many people move from New Jersey down to Florida. They can't keep warm. So this is the problem. David's sick. He's feeble. He's frail. He's old. All of these things going on. Now look what happens. Now Adonijah, whose mother was Haggith, who's that? It's one of David's wives. So what's going on here? One of David's sons says to himself, put himself forward and says, I will be king. Now, the idea of putting himself forward means elevating himself. He believes that he should be king. Why? Well, he was born before Solomon. And in his mind, the rightful descendant of the throne, or the rightful claimant to the throne is him. I was born first. Even today, what's going on? Who's king now in England? French, or I should say King Charles now. Why? Because he was the oldest heir to the throne, oldest male heir to the throne. So he puts himself forward, he elevates himself and says, I will be king. Now tell me if this sounds familiar. Look what happens. He gets chariots and horses ready with 50 men to run ahead of him. Where have we heard this before? Who else did this? Anybody home?
Saul did.
Who?
Saul.
Saul?
Yep.
Yes. Who else? Which other son of David elevated himself to say that he should be king? Absalom. Same exact modus operandi. He says, I should be king. And who knows what the mindset is of someone who wants to do this? This is a seeking of earthly elevation of status. That's all it is. Absalom believed that he should be king. He thought that he was better. He felt he was better able to serve. He wanted the adulation of the people. Remember, that's what he did. He would have these chariots, and the men would run in front of him. He would make a big spectacle of himself, and he would go from town to town, elevating himself. And then he would create problems between the people and David. If there was somebody that would take your case to the king, wouldn't that be great if you had a king that really listened to you? And so Absalom undercut David's authority. Well, now here we have Adonijah, who is looking at his father, who is truly not far away from death, as far as we can tell, not far away. So he's thinking, I know that I was born before Solomon was born, and rightfully the kingship should come down to me. And what does he do? He goes through the same type of thing. He makes a big spectacle of himself. He goes from town to town. He has the young men run in front of his chariot. You can imagine what that is. That chariot must be going. He's cruising is what he's doing. He's just cruising along, and all of these young men are running in front of him. Now, here's a problem, and this goes to show that no matter how good God's servants can be, there almost always you're going to find some negative aspect to their character. One of the problems that David had with Absalom is that he never rebuked him. He never took the young man in hand, and he could have stopped a lot of it had he simply not spoiled his children. That's really what it comes down to. He spoiled his children. Now look at what it says in verse 6. It says, his father had never rebuked him, saying, why do you behave as you do? Look at also this. He was also very handsome and was born next after Absalom. So he's thinking, okay, well, Absalom's no longer in the picture. I should be next in line to the throne, certainly ahead of Solomon. So here he is, this handsome young man, much like Absalom was. He felt he had a case, and he was going to go ahead and make his play and get his name well known before his father passes. And that way, when his father does pass, people are just they're going to clamor for Adonijah rather than for Solomon. All right. He would be a very good politician. He's doing exactly what people think. You appeal to people. How do you appeal to them? Sometimes you appeal to their baser nature. What do you think he was doing with all of those people? The people would look at him and say, "Wow, look at that handsome young guy in that chariot. Look at him. Just look at he's making a presence for himself amongst the people." So Adonijah knew what he was doing. Let's go a little bit further down. Adonijah conferred. Now here's where it comes from a personal thing. Then it becomes a conspiracy. Adonijah conferred with Joab. Now, who is Joab? Joab was the commander of the armies, wasn't he? Commander of David's armies. He confers with Joab and Abiathar, the priest, and they gave him their support. So what does he do? He enlists two very important people in this conspiracy to put him on the throne instead of Solomon. He puts the commander of the army on his side, and he also gets one of the priests. And Abiathar was a descendant of Eli, and that comes into play just a little bit further on. But now he's got two very important figures at play and at work with him in this conspiracy. But Zadok, the priest, Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, Nathan the prophet, Shimei, and Ray, and David's special guard did not join Adonijah. So apparently the overture was made towards them, but they did not join. They were going to support their king. And nobody's going to be king until David is gone. But here he's wanting to go ahead and start his ascendancy before it's actually supposed to begin. So then what does he do? He then sacrifices sheep and cattle and fatted calves at the stone. He invites all of his brothers, the king's sons, and all the royal officials of Judah, but did not invite Nathan the prophet or Benaiah or the special guard or his brother Solomon. This tells us, and I believe this makes an important point. He knew who was supposed to be king. He knew who was supposed to be king. He merely wanted to subvert who was supposed to be king. He didn't invite the young man who was supposed to ascend to the throne of David. So he's gathering his group of his cadre of co-conspirators and supporters. He excludes the very people that would have certainly denounced any of this, and he begins to make merry with his guests. So now, Nathan, the prophet, that loyal subject of David's and that loyal prophet of God, asks Bathsheba, Solomon's mother, "Have you not heard that Adonijah, the son of Haggith," remember, it's not her son, it's David's son, it's not her son, "has become king?" I tell you what, I'm going to stop right here. What does this tell us about God's plan for marriage? What's God's plan for marriage? One man, one woman together for life. Every single time one of God's people has multiplied wives and concubines and consorts to themselves, has there ever been anything good that came out of it? Not once. Not once.
Very seldom is that the case now.
It almost never is. Now, today we don't have polygamy in the sense that they had it, but what happens when there's spouse after spouse after spouse after spouse? You know, I hear all the time about people who have mixed households. You know, you've got husband and the wife, and then they separate and they blend together and stuff like that, or the man and his new wife and their kids get together. And does it happen? Can it happen for good? It can, but there are so many dangers caught up and bound up in this, and this is yet another one of them. So he says, "Have you not heard that Adonijah, the son of Haggith, has become king?" Well, he's a little premature, isn't he? He hasn't become king yet, but he's on his way to getting the people on his side. And our Lord David knows nothing about it, so he wasn't aware of this conspiracy. Now then, let me advise you how you can save your own life. Why would this be saving her life? And the life of your son Solomon. How would this be saving their lives? Well, what almost inevitably happens when someone ascends to the throne by fraud, deceit, subterfuge, however you want to look at it. What happens to the people who are rightful heirs to the throne when someone unlawfully comes to the throne? What happens to these people over here?
They're usually murdered.
They're very much so. Usually the new king says, well, in the name of security, in the name of making sure that there's no problems and no one comes, never mind that I usurp the throne. I don't want anybody to usurp it from me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take out anybody that might be a competition for the throne. You're absolutely right. So what likely would have happened? Bathsheba and Solomon would have been executed. They would have been slaughtered, whether openly accused of something or taken out back, as they used to do in Soviet Russia, where they took them out back and shot them in the back of the head, summary justice. Likely, Bathsheba and Solomon, their lives would have been forfeit. So Nathan is well aware of this. He is still loyal to his king, David. He is loyal to God. He doesn't want this to happen. He knows that Solomon is going to be the one that's going to ascend to the throne because he's going to be the one that's going to build this temple for God. So he says, okay, let's stop this right here. This is a way that you can do it. He said, go into King David and say to him, my lord the king, did you not swear to me, surely Solomon your son shall be king after me, and will he sit on my throne? Or he will sit on my throne. Why then has Adonijah become king? While you are still there talking to the king, I will come in and add my word to what you have said. Now, one thing we need to make very clear, we don't find recorded the promise that David made to Bathsheba that her son would become king. I've looked. I cannot find it anywhere. But I do know this. Nathan is certainly no liar. In fact, he was the one that confronted the king in his deception. So it's highly unlikely that Nathan would tell her to go in and say something that was completely untrue. Even everything he's saying to her is absolutely true. He's telling her to go in and confront the king and what's going on. So we know beyond a shadow of a doubt that what's being said is accurate. He was promised the throne. David promised him the throne. Why? Because God told David that your son is going to do this for me. All right. So we need to make sure that we understand that the promise that David made to Bathsheba is real, and it was witnessed, and it was told him by God. Continuing on. So Bathsheba goes to see the aged king in his room. She bows down, and and the king says, what do you want? She says, my lord, you swore to me, your servant, by the Lord your God, Solomon your son shall be king after me, and he will sit on my throne. But you don't know, Adonijah has now put himself in the position of king. He has become king. Whether he's been anointed or not, he has, for all intents and purposes, become king. All right. Now, what happens if, as soon as the Lord the king is laid to rest with his ancestors, in verse 21, I and my son Solomon will be treated as criminals. They will be enemies of the throne, enemies of the king. And enemies of the king were either imprisoned for life or they were executed. Likely they would be executed. While she was still speaking, Nathan comes. Nathan the prophet is here. So he went before the king and bowed. He says, have you, the Lord of the king, declared that Adonijah shall be king, and he will sit on your throne? Today he has gone and done all these things, sacrificed all of these animals. He invited all of these people to this feast, and right now they're eating and drinking with him, and they're saying, long live King Adonijah, which is a terrible thing because David is what? Still king. He is still king. This is in our words, this is a coup attempt. They're going to displace David from being king while he is still on the throne. He may be weak, he may be infirm, but he is still king. So he's speaking against the Lord's anointed. This is a dangerous thing.
Can I ask why Solomon would be considered? Not sure.
He would be why he would be an enemy to the throne. Yes. He would be so in the mind of Adonijah. In Adonijah's mind, Solomon would always be a threat because he was supposed to be king. People knew he was supposed to be king, and he was taken away from that position by Adonijah. So he was always going to have to be looking over his shoulder at anybody that may see fit to say, hey, we need to put the rightful king on the throne. If you ever want to get a really true look at all of this, look at the golden age and even further back of European history and the kings, and all of the courtroom drama, the backrooms dealings that went on in those particular points in time. Look at the Pope. Look at the succession of popes all the way from the beginning. There was as much treachery and backstabbing and double dealing in Europe as there ever was, here. It just goes to show mankind hasn't changed very much. Okay. All right. Verse 26, but me, your servant, and Zadok the priest, and Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, and your servant Solomon, he did not invite. What does this tell you? He knows He knows, and he's edging us out. Is this something the Lord, my Lord the King, has done without letting his servants know who should sit on the throne of my Lord the King after him? So now they are not engaging in subterfuge. They're not engaging in fraud with David at this point. They're merely letting him know this is what's happening. And I know maybe David his mind may be a little bit, cloudy. He may be in that idea, that fog that happens sometimes in people's minds as they get a little older. He may not remember all this, but now they're bringing all of it to his remembrance and saying, is this something that you've said? Because right now, this is what's happening. And if you don't do something about it, this is what's going to happen to us. Did David love Bathsheba? Of course he did. Did he love his son Solomon? Obviously, he loved his son Solomon. So now he's saying, oh, I've got to do something about it. So look what he says. Verse 28. Then King David said, call in Bathsheba. So she came into the king's presence and stood before him. He says, and he took an oath. As surely as the Lord lives, I will surely carry out this very day what I swore to you, swore to you by the Lord, the God of Israel. Solomon, your son, shall be king after me, and he will sit on my throne in my place. And if Bathsheba acknowledges this, and her mind's set at ease right now because David's getting ready to take action. So now let's think about this. David has gone from being this infirm, feeble king that cannot keep warm at night, and he's been almost infantilized just by the treatment of him. Now what's happened? He's regained a little bit of vigor, hasn't he? David was always a king of action. He was always a king of action. There was always something going on with him. He was always doing something. And the times that he didn't do something, where he was at leisure, what ended up happening? What happened when he remained in Jerusalem while all of his men went out to fight? He sinned. He was slack. He didn't have anything going on. He wasn't busy doing something, occupying his mind on something good. And what happened? There are people that are like that, aren't there? If they're not busy doing something, you could almost watch them kind of retreat into themselves. But David was not like that. If you look at it, how many Psalms did he write? This is what he had to do something even in his off time. He's sitting there writing songs. He constantly had to be doing something. David was a man. He was a king of action, and he was a man of action. And even now, King David has revived. He's regained some of his vigor. Okay, so he says, "All right, here we do. Call in Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, and Benaiah, son of Jehoiada." When they came before the king, he said to them, "Take your Lord's servants with you, and have Solomon my son mount my own mule, and take him down to Gihon. There have Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet anoint him king over Israel." I want this done in full view of everybody. I want everybody to see that he is right. He's got the prophet, the man of God, with him, right? He's got Zadok the priest with him. And I want you to go and I want you to do this in full view of everyone. I want everyone to see what's going on here. Adonijah is not entitled to the throne, no matter what he might say and no matter what he might do. He's not entitled to the throne. So now this is the first of the anointings. This is the first anointing of Solomon. And this is in Gihon. Small, few people, compared to the second, okay? But he wants it done in full view of everyone. So what's going to happen from there? The word is going to go out, isn't it? Nobody can say, well, we didn't know. Listen, I saw it with my own eyes. I saw Solomon come, and he was riding on David's own donkey. I saw him. He was right there. He was anointed. I saw the men of God anoint him. There's no doubt in my mind that we love our King David. And again, we don't know what Adonijah was telling everyone. Hey, listen, the king doesn't know anything anymore. He's old. He can't take care of himself. And we don't know what was being said. But likely it was not a decision that he was making because he wanted what was best for the kingdom. It was what was best for Adonijah. All right. Blow the trumpet, shout, "Long live King Solomon." Then you are to go up with him, and then he is to come and sit on my throne and reign in my place. I have appointed him ruler over Israel and Judah. Amen. That's what he gets. Amen. Absolutely. That's what we're going to do. So when David told them to do this, what did they do? They did exactly that. They went and they did exactly what the Lord or what David had told them to do. So Adonijah, at verse 41, Adonijah and all the guests who were with him heard it as they were finishing their feast. Okay, so this gives us a little bit more information. Where was Adonijah and all of his guests? Where were they having their feast?
Parting them.
They were right there. So they heard it. They heard the trumpets. They heard all of this going on. So what happens? Let's continuing on. They heard it as they were finishing their feast. On hearing the sound of the trumpet, Joab, the commander of the armies, the man that should have known better, who should have known better, asked, "What's the meaning of all the noise in the city?" Even as he was speaking, Jonathan, son of Abiathar, the priest, arrived. Adonijah said, "Come in. A worthy man like you must be bringing good news." Verse 43, "Not at all," Jonathan answers. "Our Lord King David has made Solomon king. The king has sent with him all of these men. They've anointed him king at Gihon. From there they have gone up cheering, and the city resounds with it." That's the noise you hear. You know, it's that old saying, you don't often hear the sound of your own demise. They hear the sound of their own demise. They realize that everything that they had planned up to this point has now come crashing down because David, that beloved king, has appointed Solomon to take his place on the throne. And at this point, they realize they really don't have any support left. So what do? Continuing on 40, verse 49. At this, all of his guests rose in alarm and dispersed. Why were they scared? Why would they rise in alarm and disperse? What would be the point behind that? Why were they scared of it?
You don't want to be caught with a guilty party.
It's right, man. Guilty by association, right?
That's exactly right.
If you were there, if you were there, likely you would at least be considered a co-conspirator. So now, what do they want to do? They want to get up and get out of there before anybody puts draws a line between these 2 points. Or anybody puts 2 and 2 together, they're getting up and they're getting out of town. Everybody's going to go back to their town, and they can say, "Well, I had no part in it. I don't want anything to do with it. I didn't know what was going on." Plausible deniability. This is what they do. They disappear. But Adonijah, in fear of Solomon, because remember at this point Solomon has all the authority that David had. He is going to reign as king, and for a while he reigns as co-regent or co-king, so to speak, with David. So he goes and he takes hold of the horns of the altar. Now, why did he do that? That was a place of refuge. It was a place of refuge. People who were guilty of involuntary manslaughter, they didn't mean to, but they killed someone. Well, the people don't care, they're going to come after him. He could take hold of the horns of the altar, and it would basically be a place of refuge. He could stay until everything was sorted out and there could be a fair trial instead of vigilante justice on the part of the people that were wrong. So he goes, he takes a hold of the horns of the altar. Solomon says, "Adonijah is afraid of you. He's clinging to the horns of the altar. Let King Solomon swear to me today that he will not put his servant to death with the sword." And look at what Solomon does here. Solomon makes it he actually extends a great deal of grace, doesn't he? Great deal of grace and mercy. He says, if he shows himself to be worthy, not a hair of his head will fall to the ground. But if evil is found in him, he will die. That sounds familiar. That's the idea of mercy and grace. What did Adonijah deserve?
Yeah.
He deserved death. But Solomon extends grace and mercy. Listen, if he finds to be himself to be worthy, if he rejects everything that he's done so far, if he shows himself to be a worthy subject, to be a loyal subject to the throne, then he won't be killed. But if there's evil found in him, in other words, if he continues on in his quest for the throne, then he's going to die. Then King Solomon sent men. They brought him down from the altar. Adonijah came and bowed down to King Solomon and said, and Solomon said, "Go to your home." All right. Continuing on. Now, this runs. What happened? Yeah. Give me just a second. All right. Chapter 2, 1 Kings chapter 2 and 1 Chronicles chapter 28 are the verses that run almost concurrently. If you look at what's going on, yes, sir.
There's a question online.
Yes.
Maybe a little older. What was the importance of hanging on to the horns of the altar?
I don't know if it was necessarily. I don't see. I looked. I could not find where that was a commandment of God that was something, or if it was merely just a custom. I would think so, because God had already established cities of refuge that they could flee to. But if you were not close to one of those cities, this would be something that would be, for one thing, if you're clinging onto the horns of the altar, what can't happen? There's no you're saying hang on to the horns of the altar. There's no sacrifice. So it's like, okay, we got to figure out what's going on with this guy, because we can't do our job until we figure out what's going on with this guy. So they would find out what's happening, and once they did that, it wasn't like he had to sit there and hold on to it forever. It was, okay, we're going to establish what's going on, and then we'll either make preparation for a fair trial for whoever it is. They may give up their claim, any manner of things. But as far as significance is concerned, I don't know if there is necessarily a significance to actually holding on to the horns of that altar. I wish I could say anything more than that, but I didn't find anything. Why are those horns significant? I couldn't begin to tell you.
The horns symbolize authority and power.
Yeah.
So would it be sort of my initial thought, without having done any research, would be something to the effect that it's
Appeal to authority?
Appeal to authority.
Okay. Yeah. It could be it. That could very well be. That's the purpose behind the horn aspect of it. It also shows that there's that grace and mercy is extended. They could just as easily. Solomon could just as easily, if he'd not accepted that appeal, he could just easily said, no, get him out of there, take him out of the street and slaughter him. But even Solomon saw that and listened to it. He heard the appeal. He said, okay, I'll tell you what we're going to do. If he shows himself to be worthy, then we won't kill him. If he is still evil, then he's going to die. So
Absalom and Adonijah, they were passed over in favor of Solomon. Do you know why that was?
Well, one of the issues with Absalom, no matter what was going on, Absalom sought to take the throne by force. That was the problem. Even if Absalom had ever been considered for the throne, his actions precluded that ever from happening, because he had stretched out his hand against God's anointed. David didn't even do to Saul what Absalom was going to do to his father. He had no regard for the word of God. He had no regard for his father. He had no regard for tradition, for God's anointed. None of that. He was a naughty little boy, and he suffered the punishment that naughty little boys come to if they just continue on in their error. Why David rejected Adonijah? Well, mainly because we see where David was going to build a house for God, and God said, no, your son Solomon's going to do it. So likely David, when he hears this, comes to Bathsheba and says, your son will sit on the throne. She could have exacted the promise from him before. Again, we don't see the charge the promise that David made to her, so we're not aware of the circumstances that surrounded it. But God certainly had plans for Solomon on the throne of Israel. And through David, that direct line all the way through, there was going to be a king from David sitting on that throne. But why Adonijah? Why he wasn't considered? Because that was the case. Typically, it was the oldest son, but that's not always the case.
So the only thing you can think of as far as he's concerned is that he may have acted hastily. God is the one who decides.
Well, in the case of Solomon, anyway, Solomon had already been decided that Solomon was going to sit on the throne. No matter what Adonijah did, it was going to be. Remember, God said, once God says something, it's going to happen regardless. It's if He says that Solomon's going to sit on the throne, there is nothing that man can do. There is nothing Adonijah could do about that. God was going to thwart him in some way, shape, or form. He just used, justice to thwart him. Okay. All right. So let's look at chapter 28, First Chronicles chapter 28 and First Kings chapter 2. Again, these things run concurrently. David has had this renewed spirit, hasn't he? He was old, weak, and firm in the bed. Now, all of a sudden, he's out this second life. I think he realized that if he did not make plans, he did not make preparations. It's like writing a will. Can you die and hope that all of your world's possessions and your family won't fight about it, and that everything will go where it's supposed to go? Can you hope that will happen? Of course you can. But what's the prudent thing to do? Make sure you write a will. You make sure that everything is spelled out exactly what's supposed to happen. And David kind of has this renewed spirit, and he begins really has almost a second second life that's been breathed into him. It doesn't last very long, but it does last long enough for him to really take Solomon in hand and point out to him everything that he's supposed to do. He gives him a charge. He gives a charge to Israel. He makes sure that all this preparation is done, that everything's ready to go when Solomon ascends to the throne. He begins that work of building that temple. He's busy in doing all of that right now. So let's look at a little bit in First Chronicles chapter 28. My Bible has the heading of David's charge to Israel. So David assembled at Jerusalem all of the officials of Israel, the officials of the tribes, the officers of the divisions that served the king, the commanders of thousands, the commanders of hundreds, the stewards of all the property and livestock of the king and his sons, together with the palace officials, the mighty men and all the seasoned warriors. Then, so I mean, who's in Jerusalem and all of this is going on? Everybody that's anybody that has any sense of power or authority in Israel, they are all together. They're gathered together. David rises to his feet and he says, "Hear me, my brothers and people." And here he gives an account again that he had in his heart to do what? To build a house for the Lord. I mean, I think that's an incredible thought. He says, "Why am I living in this beautiful home when my God dwells in tents?" No, God said, "I didn't ask you to build me a house, but your son is. You won't, but your son is." So he makes this. He gives them this this account of what's happening. And go to verse 6. He said to me, God said to David, "It is Solomon your son who shall build my house and my courts. For I have chosen him to be my son, and I will be his father. I will establish his kingdom forever. I will establish his kingdom forever, if he continues strong in keeping my commandments and my rules as he is today." So it tells us a couple of things. Number one, God's promises are conditional, aren't they? They always are. I will be your God, and you will be my people if you keep my commandments and my statutes. I will establish his throne forever if he keeps my word. Same thing for us today, right? Is God's promise to us conditional? Absolutely. Yeah, it's always conditional. Now, the great thing about it is what God expects from us, compared to what we're given, what he expects from us is actually really small. It really, really is. This is be faithful unto death. That's the promise that he exacts from us. And if you do that, I will be your God, and my son's blood will cleanse you from your sin, and you will come to live with me forever if you keep my commandments, if you keep my statutes, if you keep the law of Christ. No, it's always conditional. All right. I will establish his kingdom together if he continues strong in keeping my commandments and my rules as he is today. It also tells us that at this particular point in time, Solomon is what? Very faithful. Solomon is a faithful young man. He seeks the wisdom of God. He seeks the instruction of his father. And right now, he's like that Christian that first comes up out of the water, right? Man, when we come out of the water, we're excited. And what do? I was once a small young lad, and when I came up out of that water, I made this grandiose promise that I could never keep. I'll never sin again. I'll never sin again. Now therefore, in the sight of all Israel, here gives them the charge, the assembly of the Lord, and in the hearing of our God, observe and seek out all the commandments of the Lord your God, that you may possess this good land and leave it for an inheritance to your children after you forever. And you, Solomon, now right now, look what he says. And now you, Solomon, my son, know the God of your father. Serve him with a whole heart and a willing mind. Verse 10, be careful now, for the Lord has chosen you to build a house for the sanctuary. Be strong and do it. Then David gives Solomon his son the plan of the vestibule of the temple and its houses and treasures and all of these things. He gives them this master plan. This is what I had in mind to do. This is what I had purpose to do. The Lord tells me not to do it, but I'm giving this to you. I've already set you well on your way to doing all of the things that are necessary to do. Verse 19.
Hey, Chuck,
Yes, sir.
you know, you think about it, it's interesting that when the tabernacle was built, God gave Moses the plans. But when the temple was built, those were David's plans. It was a human set of plans that built the temple, but God's plans that built the tabernacle.
There are a lot of similarities between the tabernacle and the temple, but there are a lot of things that are not quite the same. Yes, sir.
You guys online hear him the same, or did his mic drop out?
Oh, yep.
Yeah, his mic's dropped out.
Yeah, my battery's went dead. Hang on a second. There we go. Can you hear me again?
Are you recording?
Yes, I hear you now.
All right. Good deal. Good deal. All right. So you're absolutely right. God had given Moses the plans for the tabernacle to its exact specification. David gives the plans for the temple to Solomon. They were plans that David had made. And you'll see that there are some things that are found in the temple that, honestly, if you look back and you see the instructions that God gave the Israelites, there are some things in there. There are some aspects to the temple that, truthfully, if you wanted to get detailed oriented, they would be in conflict with some of the things that God had put into motion. So the laws that God made. But anyway, you're absolutely right. But there are a lot of other things. The labor that went into the tabernacle, whose labor was that? That went into the tabernacle, whose labor was it?
It was volunteers from the Israelites.
That's right. It was all volunteers. How did they get all of the things that they used to build the tabernacle with? The people came up out of their pocket, right? They gave and gave until Moses said, "Tell the people that's enough. We have more than we need. There's no need. We have more than enough."
Chuck, it was part of this. Wasn't it part of the spoils that came out of them, or came out of Egypt with them when they came out?
Yes, God had despoiled Egypt, given it to them, but at that point it became theirs, didn't it?
Yes.
It was theirs to do with as they wished.
Yes.
And they chose to give to the tabernacle of God because they understood that the Lord, when the Lord says, "I want you to do something," He wants them to do it. But He still asked them to do it with a willing heart and a cheerful heart. Didn't He? It's kind of like our giving today.
Yeah, they gave freely.
Yeah, give freely, right? Without hesitation and without begrudging it. You know, it's always nice to see that the contribution is what it needs to be, but the most important part of it is the hearts behind that contribution. It's nice to see a big number because things are being taken care of and programs can be funded and salaries can be paid and the building, all this stuff. But at the end of the day, what's really important behind it all is the heart that goes into the money that ends up in that treasury. That's why those widows' mites were such a great lesson for the temple when Jesus was sitting there with all those people. All right, verse 20. Then David said to Solomon his son, "Be strong and courageous, and do it. Do not be afraid, and do not be dismayed. For the Lord God, even my God, is with you. He will not leave you or forsake you until all the work for the service of the house of the Lord is finished." So here he is. He's been given this charge to Israel. He's given this charge to Solomon in full view of everyone. So now Solomon's on the hook, isn't he? He's in full view of everybody. He's been delivered these plans. He's been delivered these instructions and a charge to go and do it. Kind of like what we need today. We need a charge. Go and do. Jesus gives a charge to his disciples, didn't he? Go therefore and what? Make disciples. Where? In Jerusalem? Everywhere. Everywhere you go, you make disciples. So remember, God is always a God. He's a God of movement. He's a God of action. We always need to be. I heard somebody say this the other day in a sermon, and he said, or a prayer said, "Lord, help us to be effective." And I think that's spot on. We need to be effective servants. All right. Now, he also makes a charge to Solomon. This is in 1 Kings chapter 2, continuing on with the charge. And we're going to stop here in just a second. I'll tell you what, this is a good time to stop. So let's stop here for 10 minutes, and then we'll pick back up at 7. All right, so we stopped at 1 Kings chapter 2, and let's go to 1 Chronicles chapter 29, because right after the accounts of 1 Chronicles chapter 29, the account of 1 Kings chapter 2 begins. And a lot of this is running concurrently, but what we have in 1 Chronicles 29 is David's address to the people. And look what he says. David the king says to all assembly, chapter 9 and verse 1, 1 Chronicles 29 and verse 1, Solomon, my son, whom alone God has chosen, is young and inexperienced, and the work is great. For the palace will not be for man, but for the Lord God. So I provided all of the things that were necessary: the gold, silver, bronze, brass, iron, wood, quantities of onyx and stones, setting stones, antimony, colored stones, all sorts of precious stones, and marble. In addition to all that I provided for the holy house, I have a treasure of my own, and I give it to the house of my God. 3,000 talents of gold, of the gold of Ophir, 7,000 talents of refined silver for overlaying the walls of the house. This is what a construction. Everything in it's going to be either gold or silver plated. And for all the work to be done by craftsmen, and gold for the things of gold and silver for the things of silver, who then will offer willingly, consecrating himself today to the Lord. So as Moses asked the people of Israel for everybody to give a free will offering, David is doing this, and he's setting the example himself, isn't he? Look at I'm not boasting in this. I'm just simply saying this is what I have. This is my personal. This comes from me personally. It's kind of like when he bought that threshing floor, right? The owner of the threshing floor said, "Take it. It's yours. If it's going to God, it's yours." And he said, "No, I'm not going to take it. How can I take something that costs me nothing? How can I give something to God that costs me nothing?" So then the leaders of the fathers' houses made their free will offerings, as also the leaders of the tribe, the commanders of thousands, hundreds, and the officers over the king's work. And they gave for the house of the Lord, house of God, 5,000 talents and 10,000 derricks of gold, 10,000 talents of silver, 18,000 talents of bronze, and 100,000 talents of iron. And whoever had precious stones gave them to the treasury of the house of the Lord in the care of Jehiel the Gershonite. People rejoiced because they had given willfully, for with a whole heart they'd offered freely to the Lord. David the king also rejoiced greatly. Again, a great lesson for us. If it doesn't cost us something, then it's not sacrificial giving. If we give simply out of our abundance, then it's not sacrificial. It came from our hand, but it's not sacrificial. It needs to bite us.
2 mites. She put in those 2 mites, which was maybe half a cent, and it was everything she had. But
Yep.
the rich man,
You can imagine, because I did a little bit of research into that, and it was very commonplace for people to stand opposite the treasury box and for people to watch. It was almost like a sightseeing. There was people watching, and you would stand, and of course all these older Jewish gentlemen, they're all standing there, and all every time somebody would put something in, they could say, I know you can give more than that, or and they would boast about how much they gave, and they would oftentimes, what I was reading, and I actually asked. I always like to go to the source. I would ask many of the Jewish scholars. I get in contact with rabbis and people who have experience with this. And I said, "So what about this?" And he said, "Oh yeah, it would be commonplace for somebody to go, and as they got ready to put it in, to extend their arms and to show it, make sure that everybody saw what they were putting in, and then they would lay it in there, and there would be almost applause. And here comes this woman, and nobody's even paying attention to her. I imagine Jesus might have been the only person even looking at this woman. And she puts in those 2 mites. And he said, "Do you see that? All these other people, they gave out of their wealth. She got everything she had." Right? So here's what we've got going on here. These people are actually giving a free will offering, and it's a sacrificial offering. Okay? So David blesses the Lord in the presence of the assembly. And he says, "Blessed are you, O Lord, the God of Israel, our Father, forever and ever." And he goes into it. So I want you to look at verse 14. I think this is a question that is a great question for us to ask. Who am I and what is my people that we should be able to thus offer willingly? For all things come from you, and of your own have we given you. Boy, what an outstanding thought process to have. Everything that I have is from God. So all I'm doing is giving back to God the things of God, but that's what he wants me to do. And he will bless me when I give him back. Isn't that interesting? It's like if I give my daughter $2 and she gives it back to me, I bless her for having given me the $2 back. I want to tell you something. You want to be humble. Be somewhere and you reach down your pocket, you realize you don't have enough, and then your kid says, well, Daddy, I've got some money. You think,
You've saved.
that humbles you because you realize that your daughter, your son, whoever it may be, is willing to give up something. They don't expect it back. They just said, if you need this, it's yours. It's like it hollows you out. So he goes into all of this. He gives this great oration to the people, and all of it is with the understanding that God is the fount of all blessing. Give back to him the things that are his. If you do all of these things, then God is going to bless you. He will make you a great people. He will continue to be generous to you. He'll be continuing to do all of these things. Verse 18, O Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, our fathers, keep forever such purposes and thoughts in the hearts of your people and direct their hearts towards you. Interesting. We ask God to direct our hearts towards him. And he says he'll do that. We're praying for him to do that for us. Not of our own ability, but he'll direct our thoughts back to himself if we just allow it. Grant to Solomon, my son, here's the last request. Grant to Solomon, my son, a whole heart that he may keep your commandments, your testimonies, and your statutes, performing all of them. Performing all of them, and that he may build the palace for which I made provisions. He says to the assembly, bless the Lord your God, and they all blessed the Lord, the God of their fathers, and bowed their heads and paid homage to the Lord and to the king. Look at these sacrifices, folks. 1,000 bulls, 1,000 rams, and 1,000 lambs, all of the drink offerings and sacrifices in abundance for all Israel. So everything that they would normally bring to Jehovah in sacrifice, they offer up on that day drink and grain and all of the myriad of sacrifices that were acceptable to the Lord. That's what they bring. Can you imagine how long it would take to sacrifice 1,000 bulls, 1,000 rams, and 1,000 lambs? This is not a 30-minute. See, we get upset if church goes over 10 minutes. These people are standing there all day watching these sacrifices being made, but they're excited, isn't it? It's a changing of the guard. How many of them were waiting? They heard that David had made provisions for the temple, but now they get to see things start because David's not going to be around much longer. Solomon's going to start this great work, and now they're going to have this great, beautiful temple to go to God and to sacrifice and to worship. They're just very excited, and it's almost like a rededication of themselves to the purpose that God's called them to be.
Hey, Chuck.
Yes, sir.
We think about it too. You're talking about the time. These animals are not pre-prepared. I mean, you take them to the altar, and that's when you kill them. You kill them there at time of sacrifice. So this is, as you said, it's a long, drawn-out process because not only do you have to sacrifice the animal, you got to prepare the animal for sacrifice.
That's right. It's no small thing because they didn't do it en masse. They brought it up one at a time. They sacrificed them. There's a particular way in which the priest was to sacrifice, and it was not something that happened. It was not and here's the less appealing aspect of it. Can you imagine the noise, the cacophony of noise that was going on during all of this? This was not some quiet Solomon thing when he says, bless the Lord your God. That means everybody. It says, look what they said. And they all bowed their heads and blessed the Lord. So they're all offering up these prayers at one time and shouting to the heavens, blessing Lord God. And then they begin to sacrifice all of these animals. And it was, I don't want to say it was chaotic, but we would be absolutely taken aback if we stumbled upon something like that. If we stumbled on a clearing where everybody is shouting to a God and they're slaughtering animals and all the animals are making noise and it's just this. But how did God view that? To him, that was what? It was incredible. Anytime we worship God acceptably, it goes up as a what? A sweet smelling aroma. It's a savory aroma in his nostrils. Kind of like when you're walking on a Sunday afternoon or Saturday afternoon, you're walking through the neighborhood and you smell somebody in the backyard and they're grilling steaks or barbecue or hamburgers. And it's like, oh, and what do you want? You want what they're having. But that's how God views it. It's the closest thing I can think of. To him, it's like, it's just because it's his people. It's his people giving up offerings of sacrifice and worship. He loves it. And we should love it as much as he does. And I hope we do. And then they made, in verse 22, And they ate and drank before the Lord on that day with great gladness. What were they eating and drinking? Bulls, the rams, the lambs, the drink offerings, the sacrifices, all this stuff. Once it was offered, the people ate it. So it's like a giant citywide picnic, all with the express purpose of glorifying God, and thanks for the king that they had, and in gratitude for the king that they're about to have. Probably a little premature. Solomon was not the best king, but the prospect of now this great temple is going to be built. So they're very excited. Verse 22, continuing on. And they made Solomon, the son of David, king, son of David the king. They made Solomon, the son of David, king the second time, and they anointed him as prince for the Lord and Zadok as priest. Now, why is that the case? We're going to see here in 1 Kings chapter 2, because we're going to get over to some instructions that are still left to be given. So let's put a pin in Chronicles, the account of Chronicles. We're going to switch over to 1 Kings chapter 2. When David's time to die drew near, he commanded Solomon his son, saying, I am about to go the way of all the earth. Meaning what? I'm about to die. I've had a good long life, a hard life. I mean, he was a warrior, a king, and he was a man of action. But I'm about to go the way of all the earth. I'm about to die like all men. It's appointed all men to die once, and then the judgment. Be strong and show yourself a man. Boy, you try to say that in society today, show yourself a man. People will absolutely, they'll rake you over the coals. That's just toxic. No, it's not. David's making very specific charge of Solomon. What does he mean here when he says, show yourself a man? Doesn't mean he's not denigrating women. He's saying there's something very specific that he wants Solomon to do. Take charge. To do what? You know, how many times have you read those things about, I wish young men knew now? If you're a man, this is what you do. You know, if you make a bargain, you keep the bargain. A handshake means a lot. Standing up when a woman enters the room or when she gets up from the table, holding a door open for some. All of these things once were tenets of masculinity, and one of those is you have backbone when it takes backbone to do something. You stick to it. You stick to your guns. You do what you say you're going to do. Solomon said he was going to serve God. So what is David telling Solomon in this account? You do what you say you're going to do. Show yourself to be a man. Not a denigration of women, but this is part of it. If you're a man, you stand up for what's right. You do what's right, even if it costs you. So here's this: be strong and show yourself a man. No matter what happens, you stick to it. Keep the charge of the Lord your God, walking in his ways and keeping his statutes, his commandments, his rules, and his testimonies. So when you get a lot of people who say, well, the law, we don't really need to be concerned about the rules. What we just need to be concerned about love. Is love important? Yeah, if there's not love, there's nothing. But are there things that God tells us to do? Absolutely. And we ignore those at our peril. If we say that we're going to do that, we do it. It's like when we come up out of that water, we've made a promise. I mean, we've entered into a covenant. It's a joining that we're not supposed to break. God's joined together. He's joined us and him together. Man is not supposed to separate. That goes as much for the church and God as it does for man and wife.
It's really sad that we've gone from the time when a person's word was their bond, a handshake was all it took, to now we have to have lawyers and hundreds of pages of stuff.
Absolutely.
To be signed to get somebody
something simple
with what they're going to do.
My grandfather bought I believe it was his first farm in Tennessee. He bought it from the fellow he bought it from. It was part of a larger piece of property. He bought that farm on a handshake. That was it. He says, I promise to pay you X amount of dollars. He says, okay. He said, do you want to write it? He said, no. He said, if you kept up your end of the bargain, I'll keep up my end of the bargain. And they did. And to not do it was it was reprehensible. You weren't much of a man if you didn't keep your word. And we're just talking about the world of men. I'm sure women is the same way. Look, if you say you're going to do something, you do it. So, but here he's just talking about that aspect of doing. And it's interesting that in the account of Chronicles, he says, my son is young and inexperienced. But here he says, you have to be a man. So it's those two are not in opposition to one another. This is part of it. He's showing him this is what it means to be a man, and part of it is to follow God no matter what might happen. Keep the word of God. All right.
Being young and inexperienced doesn't necessarily make you a wimp. You know what? You can still be a great man.
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
We're at one point we're all young men, and we have to learn how to be men. I know. I mean, kids kind of grow up knowing how to be kids, but you have to be taught how to be a man, because I've seen a lot of older males that are not men. They're just older males. All right. Continuing on. Verse 4, the Lord may establish his word that he spoke to me, saying, if your sons pay close attention, here's David still speaking, if your sons pay close attention to their way, to walk before me in faithfulness with all their heart and with all their soul, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. Now, this idea of your sons, this is not just the physical sons, not just the physical sons of David. This is his descendants. If his descendants continue to remember God, then God will remember them. Again, everything is conditional with God. He loves us unconditionally, but everything that draws us close to him, that puts us in a covenant relationship with him, is conditional. And it's the same way here. And it's implied that the inverse is true as well. If they do this, then you will not lack a man on the throne of Israel. If they do not, it's implied that guess what's going to happen? They will be taken off the throne, and that's exactly what happened. Rome was lost to Israel. All right. As a matter of fact, that lineage was not going to be able to be picked back up until Jesus Christ. All right, continuing on. Now, here's an interesting thing, because David remembered. He remembered that slight, didn't he? He remembered what had almost been done to him in direct conflict with what he had said was going to happen. David said Solomon was going to be his successor. He had promised his wife that he was going to be his successor. God himself had said that Solomon was going to sit on the throne, but we had conspirators who said, that's not going to happen. We're going to put Adonijah on the throne. So look what he says. Moreover, you know what Joab, the son of Zeruiah, did to me, how he dealt with the two commanders of the armies of Israel, Abner, the son of Ner, and Amasa, the son of Jether, whom he killed, avenging in time of peace for blood that had been shed in war, and putting of the blood of war on the belt around his waist and on the sandals of his feet. In other words, he had killed people in peace. He had a chance to kill them in war. He didn't kill them in war, but when peacetime came, he killed them. And that was considered unsporting. But we also got to remember how much David was not a perfect man. Who was it that drew his sword and slew Absalom as he was hanging in the branches of that tree? Joab. Think David forgot that? No. And this last, what he considered to be a traitorous act, was more than he was willing to forgive. More than he was willing to forgive. Act therefore according to your wisdom, do not let his gray head go down to Sheol in peace, or death. Don't allow him to die in peace, surrounded by his family in the comfort of his home. Don't let that happen. All right, continuing on. But deal loyally with the sons of Barzillai, the Gileadite. Let them be among those who eat at your table. For with such loyalty they met me when I fled from Absalom your brother. And there is also with you Shimei, the son of Gera the Benjaminite from Bahurim. Now look what he says here. Who cursed me with a grievous curse. And we find that in 2 Samuel, and you can write this in your notes. 2 Samuel 16, David is riding with his men, Joab, by the way, and they're riding along, and all of a sudden this man, Shimei, comes out and curses David and all of his men. A man of blood, away with such a man, away with such a man. And he curses David to his very face. So he cursed God's anointed. David is not going to forget this. David will not forget this. But when he came down to meet me at the Jordan, I swore to him by the Lord, saying, I will not put you to death with the sword. So he's using a little bit of wordplay, right? Couching his displeasure. I will not put you to death with the sword. Now, therefore, do not hold him guiltless, for you are a wise man. You will know what you ought to do to him, and you shall bring his gray head down with blood to Sheol.
There's a connection here to 2 Samuel 16.
2 Samuel 16, Shimei comes out and he curses David and the men that were with him. He was of the house of Saul, because remember, Saul was a Benjaminite. So Shimei was of the house of Saul, and he comes out and curses David with his men as they're riding. So we have Adonijah, and remember, Adonijah was given a promise: if you behave yourself, I won't kill you. If you don't behave yourself, I'll kill you. Abiathar, Joab, and Shimei. So now David has addressed these issues, and he leaves the fulfilling of this to Solomon. He doesn't do it himself. He leaves it to Solomon. In verse 10, then David slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of David. And at that time, the time that David reigned over Israel was 40 years. He reigned 7 years in Hebron and 33 years in Jerusalem, which puts him at right around 70 years old when he dies. So he was of good old age. Had achieved the usual number of years of men on this earth. So Solomon sat on the throne of David, his father, and his kingdom was firmly established. And we jump back over to the account in 1 Chronicles chapter 29. Thus David, the son of Jesse, reigned over all Israel. The time that he reigned over Israel was 40 years, 7 years in Hebron, 33 years in Jerusalem. He died at a good age, full of days, riches, and honor. And his son, Solomon, his son, reigned in his place. Now look at verse 29. Now the acts of King David from first to last are written in the Chronicles of Samuel, in the Chronicles of Nathan. We don't have the Chronicles of Nathan, do we? Not in the sense of a codified book. And the Chronicles of Gad the seer, with accounts of all of his rule and his might, the circumstances that came upon him and upon Israel and upon all the kingdoms of the countries. So, right, what have we done now? We have put David to rest. All right. David is now sleeping with his fathers in the city that bears his name, full of years, did not lack anything. Everything that God promised him has come to pass. Everything that that the Lord said he needed him to do, he's done. He's given charge to his son Solomon. He's given charge to all the people. He's established his son upon the throne. He set provisions in place for the temple to be built, and we're going to get into that here in just a couple of minutes. So here we've kind of turned the page, right, on this. So now we're going to be focusing on Solomon, at least at first.
Just a comment.
Yes.
David went to his grave then with something that happened 10 years earlier. He had not forgotten. He had still remembered. Is that good or is that bad?
We have to ask ourselves. Remember, David was a man after God's own heart, but David was not a perfect man. He was not a perfect man. But David also, there was a strong sense of right and wrong with David in the fact that almost, I wouldn't say legalistic because it's not a legal type of issue, but it is very much there are certain things that there are principles. Does anybody have principles that they absolutely will not break? Not in regards to the word of God, but there's certain things that you simply will not do. Yeah, I do. I got things in my mind that absolutely I will not break these principles. Not talking about the word of God, just in general, I just simply will not do. And that could be very well the case with David. He just simply this was something that was so, if you read the account, if you go back to 1 Samuel chapter 16, if you read the account, this was not merely it's not just some disgruntled farmer that came out and was angry. He was bitter and he cursed David. And the idea of cursing, not simply the use of profane language like we think of the idea of cursing. In his cursing, it was a curse that was pronounced. He pronounced the curse on him. God's anointed. This was beyond the pale. David was deeply offended.
What was his name again?
Shammai. And I hope I'm pronouncing that right. If you ever look at, there's an app or a website, I think it may even be a website, where you can type in Bible names and it will give you the closest pronunciation that we have to them. I encourage you to get that on your computer. Some things are not pronounced the way you think they're going to be pronounced. All right, so let's go on. Let's continue on. In 1 Kings 2, verse 13. Verse 13. Then here's Adonijah. Here he pops back up. He was well and truly, he went like a dog with his tail between his legs. He flees the scene. But then he shows back up, comes to Bathsheba, and she says this, "Do you come peacefully?" He said, "Peacefully." Then he said, "I have something to say to you. You know that the kingdom was mine, and that all Israel fully expected me to reign." That's not true. The kingdom wasn't his. He may have thought it was his. He may have wanted it to be his, but it wasn't his. But all Israel fully expected me to reign. That's not correct either. Otherwise, everybody would have been on his side. But there were a huge number of people that were not on his side. So Adonijah is not really dealing with Bathsheba in a truthful manner here And remember what Solomon's promise was. If you acquit yourself, I'll let you live. If there's evil in you, then you're going to die. Well, right off the bat, Adonijah continues on speaking falsehood to Bathsheba, his mother, to Solomon's mother. However, the kingdom has turned about and become my brother's, for it was his from the Lord. And now I have one request to make of you. Do not refuse me. Speak. He said, please ask King Solomon. He will not refuse you to give me Abishag, the Shunammite, as my wife. Bathsheba said, very well, I will speak for you to the king. There's a problem here, isn't there? Who was Abishag? Who was the lady Abishag? Where was she?
She was the attending nurse.
She was the attending nurse. She was with King David. Even though they shared a bed, they did not know each other carnally, but they shared a bed. Now his son asks for this young woman to be given to him for a wife. Does anybody here see a rather disgusting thing happening here? This is not the commandment of God where if, say, for example, there's a widow that the brother of that man that died would take her to wife. That's not what we're talking about here. This is the idea of uncovering your father's nakedness. The same woman that was with your father is now going to be with Adonijah, the son of David. This is not something that's correct. This is not something that's good. Not to mention that aspect of it, but there is also the idea that he may have wanted Abishag because Abishag is now part of the royal family. And he may have been trying to insinuate himself getting back into the royal family and to maybe find some way to take the throne again. Not quite sure, but we do know that Solomon sees through that. He continuing on. Bathsheba says, not thinking, okay, I'll speak for you to him. So she went to him, speak to him on behalf of Adonijah. He rose up. So she says, I have one small request to make. This is not a small request. This is a big thing. I have a small request to make of you. Do not refuse me. And the king said to her, make your request, my mother, for I will not refuse you. That's not true either. Don't ever make a promise and say, well, I'll do it no matter what. Because some promises are too great to agree to. Let Abishag the Shunammite be given to Adonijah, your brother, as his wife. King Solomon answers, and why do you ask for Abishag the Shunammite for Adonijah? Ask him for the kingdom also, for he's my older brother, and on his side are Abiathar the priest and Joab the son of Zeruiah. Then King Solomon swore by the Lord, saying, God do so to me and more also, if this word does not cost Adonijah his life. Now therefore, as the Lord lives, who has established me and placed me on the throne of David my father, and who has made me a house, as he promised, Adonijah shall be put to death today. So he sends Benaiah the son of Jehoiada, and he strikes him down, and he dies. All right? So now Adonijah he went for mercy. Solomon extends him mercy, and now he's made this appalling request, and Solomon has him put to death, and rightfully so. Why? If you behave yourself, you'll live. If there's evil in you, then you're going to die. All right? Verse 26, and Abiathar, the priest, the king said, go to Anathoth, to your estate, for you deserve death. But I will not at this time put you to death, because you carried the ark of the Lord God before David my father. You go back and you read the priests. Abiathar was one of them. And because you shared in all my father's affliction. So he expels him from being priest of the Lord in Jerusalem, and he has to go back home. He's not in Jerusalem anymore, acting as a priest there. He has to go back home. He's expelled him from his duties, thus fulfilling the word of the Lord that he had spoken concerning the house of Eli in Shiloh. Now, here's one thing that we need to remember as well. The people that were serving as priests of the Lord should not have been subject to the whims of a monarch. Remember, the monarchy and the priesthood were supposed to be completely separate. They were from completely separate tribes, right? You had Judah that sat on the throne in Israel, and you had Levi, who were the priests of God. It's kind of like a separation of powers. The kingship should never have that kind of authority over the priesthood. But at this point, he's exercising a kingly prerogative. He expels him from his priestly duties and he sends him back home.
Hey, Chuck.
Yes, sir.
Can we make a small comparison here?
Go for it, brother.
You think about Joseph's brothers after Jacob dies and their humility and their fear that their brother's going to kill them because of what they had done to him.
Yes.
Adonijah doesn't have the same humility. He's got almost an arrogance about him. I'm going I'm going to see if I can wind up winning this thing after all. And it's really, when you think about the way the brothers treated Joseph versus the way Adonijah treats Solomon, it's almost totally opposite.
It is. I wonder if it was part of the fact that he was an older. I don't know how much older Adonijah was than Solomon. I don't know if there was a large disparity in their ages. Truthfully, I have not looked into that.
You think about,
and
you think about Joseph being the next to the last of the sons,
right?
Except for Benjamin, the rest of them were all older than him. And
yes.
But they still understood that he was second in command in Egypt. They understood who they were dealing with.
Yeah. But that goes to show the idea of humility. They had a while to repent of that, didn't they? How long was Joseph in captivity? And as they went back, they thought they had done the right thing, but then over the time, there was a great deal of weeping and wailing over what they had done, especially when they go back and have to tell their father what's happened. Maybe for a while they felt good about it, but then afterwards they sinned in haste and repented at leisure.
If he wanted revenge, you figure he was in Egypt about 20 years before Dad and the family gets there. He had plenty of time to plot his revenge.
Oh, at any time, if he'd snapped his finger, those boys would have been dead, and the Egyptians wouldn't have cared one whit. They're just killing they're just killing people coming hats in hand for bread. They wouldn't have cared. But you're right. Compare that to Adonijah, I just think the temerity to come and ask for your father's nurse to be given to you for wife, the arrogance behind that, and that idea that this would have been something that would have been appalling to anybody who understood the word of the Lord. This is just no way. And not to be indelicate, but that'd be essentially like if it'd be like my stepbrother, and my father dies, and he says, well, that's not my mom. Why couldn't I, be married to her? We're not related by birth. Why couldn't I have? That'd be the same thing. It's essentially the same thing. And it was just not to be had. And you're right. He came with a great deal of arrogance. I would not have shown my face. I would not have shown my face in that palace for forever. But he does, and he suffered the penalty for it. So in verse 28, when the news came to Joab, for Joab had supported Adonijah, but he had not supported Absalom. Joab fled to the tent of the Lord and caught hold of the horns of the altar. Now remember, this is a different sort of fellow, isn't he? Adonijah was not a military man. Joab was. Joab knew the rough and tumble life of the military. He knew what he had stared death in the face on more than one occasion. But what does he do? He flees to the tent of the Lord and caught hold of the horns of the altar. And when it was told Joab has fled to the tent, Solomon sent Benaiah saying, "Go strike him down." Benaiah comes to the tent, says the king commands come out. Says, "No, I will die here." So in essence, what he did was he died on his own terms, even though it was by the hand of another. He died on his own terms. I will die here. Strike me down before the altar of the Lord. But here's the problem. Benaiah brought the king word again, saying, "Thus said Joab, and thus he answered me." And the king says, "Well, do as he said, strike him down and bury him, and thus take away from me and from my father's house the guilt for the blood that Joab shed without cause. The Lord will bring back his bloody deeds on his own head, because without the knowledge of my father David, he attacked and killed with the sword 2 men more righteous and better than himself, Abner and Amasa. So their blood shall come back on the head of Joab and his descendants forever. But as for David and his descendants, there shall be peace from the Lord forevermore." So Benaiah goes up, he strikes him down and puts him to death. He was buried in his own house in the wilderness. And then King Solomon puts Benaiah on the son of Jehoiada over the army in place of Joab. And the king put Zadok, the priest, in the place of Abiathar. So what has he done? He's taken away these 2 men, at least 2 men that have served his father, right? Joab and Abiathar. He's taken them down from their place, and he has put his own men that were loyal to him in their place, in their respective places, both as commander of the army and as priest of the Lord. So this is what's happened. Now, we're not done. There was another one. This is the one we're thinking of earlier. So the king sent and summoned Shimei and said to him, "Build yourself a house in Jerusalem and dwell there. Do not go out from there to any place whatever. For on the day you go out and cross the brook Kidron, know for certain that you shall die. Your blood shall be on your head." So he's been warned. Kind of like Adonijah. You behave yourself, you live. If you don't, you'll die. It's like Shemaiah. If you stay in your house, stay in your area, if you're fine. But if you cross over that brook, Kidron, you die. So he's giving him a word. Shimei said to the king, what you say is good. As you've said, so will your servant do. But as it happened, at the end of 3 years, 2 of his servants run away. And what does he do? Saddles up his donkey and he goes after his servants. The word gets back to the king that he's crossed over that boundary that Solomon had placed in around him. He's not supposed to go out of. And what does he do? King says in verse 44, the king said to Shimei, you know in your heart all the harm that you did to David, my father. So the Lord will bring back your harm on your own head. That King Solomon shall be blessed, and the throne of David shall be established before the Lord forever. Then the king commanded Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, and he went out and struck him down, and he died. So the conspirators are no more. Everything is going quite favorably at this point. And so the kingdom was established in the hand of Solomon. All right, so a lot of loose ends have been tied up, haven't they? People that deserve to die died. People that deserve mercy got mercy, even though they didn't avail themselves of that mercy for very long. They had every opportunity, but they didn't do it, did they? All right. So let's look at this. These are our parallel passages at this point. First Kings 2, verse 12 through chapter 3, verse 28. The Second Chronicles 1 through 13. All right, so we're going to look here the early days of Solomon, and a lot of the writings that we find of Solomon in Kings and Chronicles are the preparations that he makes for the temple and his making of the temple. We don't find as much in the aspect of his day-to-day life, but we do see because most of his activities are spent up in preparing for the temple and building the temple. But we also know this: Solomon wrote a couple of books on his own, didn't he? Now, I always encourage you to read his stuff. First, number one, book of Proverbs, right? Most of the Proverbs were from Solomon. Some of them were not, but most of the book of Proverbs is from Solomon. Why? Because Solomon asked God for wisdom, a double portion of wisdom, and God gave him that wisdom, more wisdom than anybody had had up until that point. And as Scripture says, anybody from that point. The problem was his wisdom was not always applied in his own life. We also have the book of Ecclesiastes. This is sort of a internal struggle, internal journey that Solomon goes with from the time that he says, I trusted and believed in the Lord, but then I decided to do things my own way. And it shows this arc that he goes on and how futile all of his own thought processes were, how futile all of his own understanding was. At the end of the day, what does he say? It's all vanity. And then, of course, we have the Song of Solomon, and that's a great study. And most churches, most congregations do not do studies of Song of Solomon. It's not meant to be. It's not supposed to be prurient. It's not supposed to be titillating. It's a fantastic parallel between a husband and a woman and her husband and God and his church. And it's absolutely, it's a beautiful, and I'm thankful that we're actually going to be doing that at Piedmont Road. We do have a quarter that's set aside to do Song of Solomon, and I'm looking forward to it. Of course, I may get asked to teach it, in which case I may not be as enamored of taking the class. But anyway, but if you want to read the mind of Solomon, read those books. Read those and study those books, and you'll get an idea of the mind of Solomon. But we're going to look and see what happens to him. What's the narrative that goes on? So let's go to 2 Chronicles 1 and 1 Kings 3. Solomon made a marriage. We'll go to the portion of Kings. Go to 1 Kings 3, because we already done most of chapter 2. That's where he takes he puts those men to death. All right, so Solomon made a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt. All right, so right off the bat, Solomon has made a grave error, hasn't he? What was the commandment of God concerning the marriages made by the children of Israel?
Just within their own people.
Within their own people. Preferably even within their own tribes. But, that's not always possible. But definitely within their own people. You were to take a wife. You were not to give your daughter in marriage outside of the nation of Israel, and you weren't supposed to take a daughter for your son from outside of the nation of Israel. Why is that? What was the purpose behind that? What was God's knowledge?
Well, you're bringing in outsiders that are going to corrupt your kingdom.
Yeah, and we see. Imagine this. Exactly what we see happen, isn't it? Exactly what we see happen.
The women are going to lead Solomon's heart away from God.
Yes. And what was the possible? Was there any other real possible outcome when we talk about the sheer number of wives and concubines that he took from outside of the nation of Israel? Was there any other outcome? Was the outcome ever really in doubt? That's exactly what they would do.
I think had something like, what was it, 300 wives and 400 concubines or something?
We're talking it, and even if those numbers aren't exactly correct, like 300 or 400 it doesn't matter. Let's put it this way: any more than one is a bad idea. It was bad for David. It was bad for Abraham. It was bad for Jacob. It was bad. It's been bad. It's been bad news from the very beginning. Now, the problem with them is because they had the wives that were arguing with one another. The problem with Solomon is the outside influence that those wives from outside the nation of Israel brought into the kingdom. Yes, sir.
I would say it's a bad idea because it stems from man, not from God.
Could be. Well, yes. Not the only bad reason, but that's one of the predominant bad reasons, right?
Hey, Chuck.
If God had said, "Hey, be happy to, be more than that, go ahead, take as many wives as you want," but God never said that, did He? He never said that. Yes, sir.
You think about too, when he starts marrying all these women, the first thing he starts doing is building temples to their gods.
Yeah. Before too long, and this is the sad part about this beautiful temple that they erected to Jehovah God, that was supposed to be His dwelling place. It's supposed to be this magnificent structure where it was literally called the house of the Lord. It was sacred. It was holy. It was built specifically for Jehovah. Pretty soon, Jehovah, figuratively speaking, is cohabitating with numerous false gods. They literally are bringing in their own statues and idols and pillars. They're actually bringing it into the house of the Lord.
You think
so what
about
happened
it.
Is, what's that?
I'm sorry. I was going to say, you think about it. What he's going to do to the temple because of his wives is no worse than what Nebuchadnezzar will do or what the Roman army will do in AD 70 when it gets there.
Yeah, and that goes to show that disobedience and rebellion against God, the form in which it takes is not the important thing, is it?
Correct.
The fact that it's disobedience and departing from God's word.
Correct.
And at first they say this, when you talk about the high places where it talks about the people still sacrifice in the high places. When those high places were originally built, they were for the purpose in the people's minds of worshiping Jehovah. That was the purpose behind it. We can worship God just as well here on the high places, these elevated platforms. We can worship Jehovah. The problem was that's not where God commanded him to be worshipped. He didn't want to be worshipped that place. He had a specific place to be worshipped. Therefore, they were unacceptable. But they said, "But we're worshiping you here." He said, "No, that's not where I told you to worship." That's why when we substitute our own viewpoints of how worship is to go, we substitute ours for God's. It doesn't matter what we think. It doesn't matter what we believe it to be. At the end of the day, it's displeasing. So at first, it's like, well, it's kind of like that. It's kind of like the encroachment. It's war by attrition. That's how all of these false prophets and false gods and false priests and idolatrous people won over Israel. It was they would bring it in a little bit at a time. They would bring it in, and they would set up a shrine in the city. Before too long, guess what? It took over. Same thing with the temple of the Lord. We're going to bring it here. It's not going to go in the temple, but we're going to be tolerant. And then pretty soon that toleration began to be acceptance, outright acceptance, and even to the point of enforcing it. Because that's exactly what Jezebel and Althea, I'm trying to remember her name. We'll see it here. We'll see her in our class. But anyway, he makes this marriage alliance, and that's exactly what it was. It's simply a marriage alliance. He takes Pharaoh's daughter, he brings her to the city of David until he had finished building his own house and the house of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. The people were sacrificing at the high places, however, because no house had yet been built for the name of the Lord. Now here it says in this, verse 3, so far, so good. Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of David his father, only he sacrificed and made offerings at the high places. What does God want? And that's a question we have to ask, because that's what it comes down to. Would God rather us simply not sacrifice than sacrifice at the wrong place or the wrong thing? Absolutely. He would rather us not do it at all than do it incorrectly or wrong or for the wrong reason. Just don't do it. Okay? But what is he doing? He's sacrificing at the high place. King went to Gibeon, for that was the great high place. Solomon used to offer 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God said, ask what I shall give you. Solomon said, you have shown great and steadfast love to the servant, your servant David, my father, who walked before you in faithfulness, righteousness, and uprightness. You have kept for him this great and steadfast love. You've given him a son to sit on his throne. And now, O Lord my God, you've made your servant king in place of David my father, although I am but a little child. He's actually around 20. I do not know how to go out or come in. In other words, I've not achieved that knowledge and that wisdom and that experience yet. And your servant is in the midst of your people, whom you have chosen, a great people, too many to be numbered, accounted for multitude. Give your servant, therefore, an understanding mind to govern your people. So why is he asking them for the wisdom? It's for specific purpose, not to magnify himself, but to promote himself as some great person, so that he can govern your people, the wisdom to govern your people. But if you look a little bit later on, how he was governing his people, the wisdom was it was not sticking. Some of it he was able to use for good, but a great deal of it he just simply did not put it into place. Yes, how to govern your people, but what did he end up doing? Taxing them and working them almost to death, to the point where there was rebellion after his death. That I may discern between good and evil, for who is able to govern this, your great people? It pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this, because you've asked this, and not asked for yourself long life or riches, the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself to understand, discern what is right. Behold, I now do according to your word. I'm giving you what you're asking for. None like you have been before you, and none like you shall arise after you. I give you also what you have not asked for, both riches and honor, so that no other king shall compare with you all your days. And here again, verse 14, that conditional promise that God makes. If you will walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and my commandments, as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your days. So remember, David died at a good old age of 70, plus or minus, around 70 years old. But here, David says, if you'll do, or God says, if you'll do everything that I tell you to do, then I'll lengthen your days. You'll live longer than your father. Who knows how long Solomon could have lived had he just simply done what God wanted him to do and kept the word of the Lord and governed the people fairly. I said, I'll let you live longer, and you'll see nothing but good. You'll be prosperous. You'll be wealthy. Your fame will spread, and the people will flourish, and everything will be good. Solomon awoke, and it was a dream. He came to Jerusalem and stood before the ark of the covenant of the Lord and offered up burnt offerings and peace offerings and made a feast for all of his servants. And here's an example, of course, of the wisdom. The two prostitutes came. They have the son. Says, this woman and I live in the same house. I gave birth to a child while she was in the house. The third day after I gave birth, she gave birth. There's no one in the house with us. Only we two are in the house. And this woman's son died because she lay on him. And she arose at midnight and took my son from beside me while your servant slept and laid him at her breast and laid her dead son at my breast. This is one of those appalling scenes. This is like a bad episode of a police procedural, but this is a true life account. This is something that's happened. When I looked at him closely in the morning, behold, he was not the child that I had born. The other woman said, no, the living child is mine, the dead child is yours. Or says, no, the dead child is yours and the living child is mine. Then they come before the king. So now they're going to test this wisdom that he has. The king said, the one says, this is my son that's alive and your son is dead. And the other one says the other. The king says, bring me a sword. Sword is brought before the king. The king says, divide the living child in two. Give one half to the one and half to the other. Then the woman whose son was alive said to the king, because her heart yearned for her son, oh, my lord, give her the living child and by no means put him to death. The other said, he shall be neither mine nor yours. Divide him. This is just what an appalling story. I mean, this is just a horrible, horrible account.
What did the baby split in half do either of them?
Well,
except cause anguish for the woman
whose child it was, right? The other one's like, look, my son's already dead. What's the problem with another dead child? But here's the thing: at the end of the day, there was really no way to establish this, was there? They were the only two in the house. There's no one else.
We didn't have any DNA.
No DNA. I mean, there was no way to discern. So what does Solomon do? He uses some of this wisdom. And if you think about the sheer amount of wisdom, I wouldn't have, I'll be honest with you, I would not have thought to do this. I would have had to play rock, paper, scissors. Because there's no way to establish whose son it is. None. They were so close in age. Nobody outside, I mean.
What could they do with DNA?
I don't know. The scriptural DNA test, I'm not sure what that would include. But what does he do? He says, here's wisdom. Use your wisdom. When you think about the discernment that it took, I would never have thought to do that. But he says he knows full well that the mother of that child is not going to let that child die. And I will say this, he's absolutely right about that. He's absolutely right about that. The mother of that child would never say, fine, give me half of the baby. I don't even care which half. Absolutely not. So he makes that command and they get ready to do it. And she said, no. Let her have the baby. Maybe I'll get to see him on occasion. Maybe I'll have some input or some presence in his life. I would rather him stay alive and be with the woman that didn't bear him than have him dead. And I mean, that's one of those things that even today it's just sort of the little light bulb goes off and you realize this is a man that's smart. That's absolutely a brilliant way of looking at it. And all Israel heard of the judgment that the king had rendered, and they stood in awe of the king because they perceived that the wisdom of God, the wisdom of God was in him to do justice. That was why it was there, is to do justice, to do the right thing, to govern the people, to guide them what was right and what was wrong. Maybe better than Saul, or definitely better than Saul, possibly even better than his father David. This was their chance, man. Everything. This is the like the chosen one. This is the guy, and he proceeds to throw it all away, get rid of all of it. All right. Let me see. Let's go to Second Chronicles 1. We're going to drop down a little bit because he had asked. This is account of also him asking for wisdom. In verse 14 of Second Chronicles 1. It says that Solomon gathered together chariots and horsemen. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horsemen, whom he stationed in the chariot cities and with the king in Jerusalem. And the king made silver and gold as common in Jerusalem as stone, and he made cedar as plentiful as the sycamore of the Shephelah. His import of horses was from Egypt and Q. Here's the problem. What was the problem with him multiplying horses and chariots to himself?
More you have, the more you want.
There was a commandment that God had given to his people. And when it talked about this, he talked about the king, what the king was not and what was supposed to do and was not supposed to do. One of those was to multiply horses to himself. Nor was he to go down into Egypt and bring horses for himself out of Egypt. So what does Solomon proceed to do? He's already broken the commandment of the Lord. Lord said, don't do that. So what does he do? He does exactly that. He multiplies horses to himself. He has chariots, and God. One of the reasons was that the kings of Israel, if they were faithful, didn't have to rely on a standing army or chariots or horsemen. Why? Because God was going to fight their battles for them. They were going to have to do the work, but God was going to make sure that battle was won if it was God's plan. Don't rely on these things. And that was expressly Deuteronomy 17. Deuteronomy 17. You're not supposed to do that. Yes, sir.
It's also the warning that God gave the children of Israel when they asked Samuel for the king, and he says, they've not rejected you, but they've rejected me. And Samuel is told to give them a long list, and he does in 1 Samuel 8. He gives them a long list of things that he warns them what the king's going to do to them. And they say, that's okay, we want the king anyway.
That's right. He's going to require all of these young men, and his young men are going to run before him, before his chariots, and he's going to compel them to serve him, and all of these things. Again, people have been warned, and the kings have been warned. It's expressly in the law. In Deuteronomy 17, it says, you're not supposed to do this. And Solomon, the king, proceeds to go and do exactly what the Lord has expressly told them not to do. Not to multiply horses, not to go into Egypt and bring them out. But look at what it says he does. He said he had Solomon's import of horses was from Egypt, and the king's traders would buy them from Ku at a price. They imported a chariot from Egypt for 600 shekels of silver and a horse for 150. So not only is he disobeying the word of the Lord, he's using money and wealth that could have been better used to improve the kingdom. He's using that to multiply these swords. These aren't free. So I mean, he's kind of like a young man who has been given car keys and a credit card. He's going to go and he's going to go on sprees. He's going to spend all of this wealth. He's going to make sure that everybody sees how magnificent the kingdom of Israel is and how magnificent Solomon is. So he's seeking to elevate himself. Even though his heart is still with God, you can already see the cracks that are starting to spread in this facade. And it's not long before things break completely and Solomon is carried away into idolatry. It's full-blown idolatry. But remember, Solomon chronicles all of this in Ecclesiastes. He talks about everything. He said, I didn't withhold anything from myself. Anything that I purposed to do, I did. I bought whatever I wanted to buy. I worshiped however I wanted to worship. I married whoever I wanted to marry. I did anything that I wanted to do. And at the end of the day, all is vanity. Vanity, vanity. All right. So here's again, we're starting to see problems. So let's go to chapter 2 of 2 Chronicles and chapter 4 of 1 Kings. I'm not going to get too much into 1 Kings chapter 4. It's talking about his officials. This list will mean virtually nothing to us. We're not going to get anything from learning these names. They are simply recorded for posterity. Perhaps to go back and maybe trace lineage, but other than that, there's really not much for us to know. They were written down as an account, and it was a. If you look at how specific these names are and where they're from, it's because they wanted the accounts to be as accurate as they possibly could be. So if you go down, that's what we find. Now I do want to go down to chapter 1 Kings 4 and chapter verse 20. 1 Kings 4 and verse 20. It just gives you an idea about the wealth and the cost for maintaining a household like Solomon's household. Judah and Israel were as many as the sand by the sea. They ate and drank and were happy. There's danger in that. We've read that, right? I will say to myself, I have much goods. Therefore, I will eat, drink, and be merry.
God said, this day your soul will be pardoned.
And then, I like the very end of that, and then who will those things be?
Yeah.
Who's going to
enjoy those?
Our reliance and our promotion of wealth is one of the most dangerous things that even as Christians we can run into. We have to be very, very careful. As a country, as a people, and as individuals, we have to be very careful about how much we put our trust in the things of this world. But look at verse 20 and following. Solomon rules all the kingdoms from the Euphrates to the land of the Philistines and to the border of Egypt. So the kingdom, the borders of the kingdom that his father gave him, they're still intact and they are still enormous. And the people were just overflowing the land. They brought tribute and served Solomon all the days of his life. Solomon's provision for one day, I want you to look at this with me. Solomon's provision, that's his household provision, the thing that the palace in Jerusalem took in one day: 30 cores of fine flour and 60 cores of meal, 10 fat oxen and 20 pasture-fed cattle, 100 sheep, besides deer, gazelles, roebucks, and fatted fowl. For he had dominion over all the region west of the Euphrates. And he had peace on all sides, and Judah and Israel lived in safety, from Dan even to Beersheba, every man under his vine and under his fig tree all the days of Solomon. Solomon also had 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariots, and 12,000 horsemen. And those officers supplied provisions for King Solomon. Now, I want you to think about what this means, what this entails. What's the story behind this? They were responsible for going and taxing the people. Those provisions had to come from somewhere. And as the people had been warned that the king would take the very best for himself, so it comes to be. This is exactly what ends up happening. I looked in just a little bit. In a year, Solomon's household, if calculations are fairly correct, in a year, Solomon's household would eat 36,500 sheep, 11,000 oxen, 10,500,000 pounds of bread. In a month, it would be 5,000 baskets of wheat flour, 10,000 baskets of meal flour, 900 oxen, and 3,000 sheep. Around 14,000 people that lived in the household, and he was responsible for. So, what does it take to run a household like that? And none of them were doing anything. These were people who were taken out of the population. They weren't contributing anything. They basically lived at the on the dime of the king, but the king was living off of the fat of the land. So he says, "I'm going to come in. I'm going to take the very best," and that's exactly what he did, fulfilling what God had told Samuel to tell the people. This is what's going to happen to you. But in spite of all that, in verse 29, and God gave Solomon wisdom and understanding beyond measure, and breadth of mind like the sand of the seashore. And look at what his wisdom. His wisdom was for the providence of the people, because if you go down to the bottom, verse 32, he also spoke 3,000 proverbs. You know, those were written for the admonition and the instruction of the people. And his songs were 1,005. He spoke of trees, from the cedar that's in Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of the wall. He also spoke of beasts and of birds and of reptiles and of fish. And people of all nations came to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom. So God gives Solomon this wisdom, but it's an incredible amount of wisdom for the physical world. We've got a problem. What do we do about this problem with the crops? Solomon was able to give them the answer. Let's do this instead of this. It's because of Solomon's wisdom that they began to have aqueducts and to began water being flowed in, fresh flowing water. He established gardens and vineyards and all of these things because of the immense amount of wisdom. He knew the best time to do something, what to do if there was an issue, how to, I don't want to put too fine a point on it, but we're talking about specific wisdom, how to produce the best grapes, what strains would go better together to produce the best type of grapes, how to increase the production of wheat, and how to increase the production of barley. All these things were nuts and bolts type of wisdom that was good, that was needful, that was necessary to make the very best of what God had blessed Israel with in the first place. So the wisdom that God gave was not simply this esoteric wisdom of, speaking in high lofty proverbs. It was down to business, nuts and bolts, brass tacks type of knowledge of all of these animals and all of these growing things and everything like that. So just goes to show God's wisdom flows in many directions, takes many forms. So this is what he's blessed Solomon with. And all people of all nations came to hear this wisdom of Solomon, and from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom. So not only did he learn all of these things, but when people had come they didn't just simply come to hear Solomon pontificate and navel gaze. This was, we've got a problem in our kingdom. Our crops are dying. What should we do? Solomon's able to give them that answer. Was he also able to talk about the philosophy of the day? Yes, absolutely. He understood philosophy. If you look at Ecclesiastes, there's a lot of philosophy in that. But a lot of it was simply a matter of, they would show up and he would just tell them these things. And this is incredible. Hey, our neighbors need to hear this, and they would come in here. So people just, this steady rotation of people coming in to hear the wisdom of Solomon. All right, let's go to chapter 2. We've got about 20 minutes. I'm sorry we didn't take another break, but I want to go ahead and get through with some of this. 2 Chronicles chapter 2. And here what we've got is Solomon is preparing to build the temple. He is making preparations. David, his father, left him an enormous amount of gold and silver and cedar and all of these things, all of these, not to mention the stuff that was in his own treasury, the things that David himself offered up for the temple. But apparently it wasn't enough. It didn't quite fit the bill. There was need for more things. But we also remember that Solomon's going to build himself a house as well. So, when we read this, take into consideration that he's going to build God a house, and he's also going to build himself a house. So Solomon purposed to build a temple for the name of the Lord and a royal palace for himself. He assigned 70,000 men to bear burdens. This is not, volunteer labor. Hey, if you got a couple of days, come down and help. He assigned 70,000 men to bear burdens. These were men who were forced labor. 80,000 to quarry in the hill country and 3,600 to oversee them. So he took a reckoning of all of the resident aliens, the people that were there, the sojourners that were there. When his father took that census, he took those numbers and he started dividing up the labor. So he put these men to hard forced labor in the temple itself and to quarry all the stone that would be brought in for the temple. And then he assigned 3,600 of their own number to oversee them. It's kind of like in the concentration camps. Most of the people that work in the concentration camps were fellow prisoners. They were assigned, they were overseers, and they were the most hated people in those concentration camps because they were their own and they were enforcing the rules and regulations of the people that were over them. Much in the same way, I don't think it was as brutal or people were dying en masse like they were then. But this was still not a good thing. Who should have built the temple of the Lord? Who should have built the temple of the Lord? Willing participants, right? Volunteers from the nation of Israel. If he had asked, how many people would have volunteered to show up and help and to labor for? Listen, I'll take a year. I'll spend a year of my life and I will work on the temple. I don't want to build a palace for Solomon, but I'll build a house for the Lord. But what does he do? He puts people in forced labor. And Solomon sent word to Hiram, the king of Tyre, as you dealt with David my father and send him cedar to build himself a house, so deal with me. Behold, I am about to build a house for the name of the Lord my God and dedicate it to him for the burning of incense and for the regular arrangement of the showbread and for burnt offerings morning and evening on the Sabbaths and new moons, appointed feasts, as ordained forever for Israel. The house that I'm about to build will be great. For our God is greater than all gods. But who is able to build him a house, since heaven cannot contain him? Who am I to build a house for him, except as a place to make offerings? So now send me a man skilled to work in gold, silver, bronze, and iron, in purple, crimson, and blue fabrics. If you ever want an interesting study of something, look and see what it took to make purple and purple, crimson, and blue fabrics. Just look at at that particular point in time, the labor that was required and what was required to make those fabrics. Trained also in engraving, to be with the skilled workers who are with me in Judah, whom my father provided. Send me also cedar, cypress, and algum timber, for I know that your servants know how to cut timber in Lebanon. My servants will be with your servants to prepare timber for me in abundance, for the house I am to build will be great and wonderful. I will give for your servants, and he pays them, right? I will give for your servant, the woodsman who cut timber, 20,000 cores of crushed wheat, 20,000 cores of barley, 20,000 baths of wine, and 20,000 baths of oil. Hiram is, the king of Tyre, is more than happy. He said, this sounds fantastic. I want you to look at this, though. Because the Lord loves his people, in verse 11, he has made you king over them. Hiram also said, blessed be the Lord God of Israel, who made heaven and earth, who has given King David a wise son, who has discretion and understanding, who will build a temple for the Lord and a royal palace for himself. We don't have no idea whether Hiram, the king of Tyre, was a believer in God. He simply could have been ingratiating himself to Solomon the way that he was friends with his father David. We don't know. But in this case, it was very common at that time to give due reverence and due respect to the gods of the people that you're talking to, but not for the people of God. I dare say that David, when he was talking to Hiram, was not respecting Hiram's God, but Hiram knew the God of the Israelites. He knew Jehovah, And he likely is kind of, making sure that everything's okay between the two of them. So I've sent a skilled man. He's trained to work in gold, silver, bronze, iron, stone, and wood, and in purple, blue, and crimson fabrics, and fine linen, to do all sorts of engraving. Verse 15, now therefore the wheat and barley, oil and wine of which my Lord has spoken, let him send to his servants. We will cut whatever timber you need from Lebanon and bring it up to you in rafts. Then Solomon counted all the resident aliens who were in the land of Israel after the census of them that David his father had taken. They were found 153,600. 70,000 of them he assigned to bear burdens, 80,000 to quarry in the hill country, and 3,600 as overseers to make the people work. I like that, make the people work. This was not volunteer labor. These people were forced labor.
Conscripted.
Yeah, that's a good word for it. Conscripted. They did not want to be there, but they were. So that's what happens. All right. Let's see. We're just going to go to the next chapter of each of these. And, chapter 5, 1 Kings chapter 5 is essentially the same words that he spoke in 2 Chronicles chapter 2. His letter to the king at Tyre, and his description of how many people were working and what all had to be done. And look at verse 13. King Solomon drafted forced labor out of all of Israel. And the draft numbered 30,000 men. And he sent them to Lebanon, 10,000 a month in shifts. They would be a month in Lebanon, 2 months at home. Adoniram was in charge of the draft. Solomon also had 70,000 burden bearers and 80,000 stone cutters in the hill country, besides Solomon's 3,300 chief officers who were over the work, who had charge of the people who carried on the work. So if you look at this, there's 30,000 men who are drafted out of Israel, the men of Israel, not the resident aliens, not the sojourners. These were men of Israel. And now they've been drafted as labor to go and to do all of this work. They'd be away for a month and then they come back for 2 months. So you think about that over the course of a year, you've got 1 to 2. So you've got 4 months at home and then 8 months at home, 4 months abroad. And you're working, constant work. Okay. So if we go to 2 Chronicles chapter 3, this, as we said before, Solomon prepares to build the temple. In this chapter, we see where Solomon begins to build the house of the Lord. We're not going to get too much into this, but just give you an idea. I think a lot of times we may have a bigger understanding or a bigger idea about how big this temple was than it actually really was. By all accounts, if we look at, and we're being fairly generous with the size, the temple essentially was 90 feet long, about 30 feet wide, and about 45 feet high. If you think about that, when we think about the temple, we think of this absolutely enormous structure. It really wasn't. It was big. I mean, you think about it, 90 feet long. 90 feet's a pretty long length. 30 feet wide. How big? I don't know how wide this room is right here, but it's probably
About 45 feet.
Okay. So this is if the width of this room is about how high it was. So you come back about a third, and you've got the width. So you're not talking about an enormous building. However, there were all sorts of edifices that came off of the building. There were different storerooms. There were all of these things. The temple itself was this big, but you had all of these anterooms that took up a lot of space, that took up a lot of material, and it kind of gives you a better idea. This is the funny thing. I said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to get online. I'm going to look and I'm going to see if I can find a fair representation of the temple, something that would be a good descriptor, that would have maybe a decent artist rendition. I found about 45 different ones, or I found 45 pictures, and every single one of them was a little bit different from the other. Not one of them was probably incredibly accurate to what was actually an accurate representation. So just take that with a grain of salt when you hear all these descriptions and you see these artist rendition of Solomon's temple. Odds are it probably looks nothing like it, but it's the closest thing that we can find, and that's fine. Doesn't matter.
How about his palace? Do you know how big?
Yes. Because I tell you what, let's look at the temple, because he built his palace afterwards, but you'll find that his palace is much bigger than the temple of God. Well, think about how big his household was. He had a lot of wives, a lot of concubines, a lot of children. He had to have a pretty big palace, but Very interesting that his palace was bigger than even the temple of God. So we're not going to get into a lot of the description of the temple. Just suffice it to say that it was extremely ornate. Just every square inch of it was covered with some sort of overlay or some sort of engraved figure or whatever it might be. Let's see. He overlaid it on the inside with pure gold in verse 4. The nave he lined with cypress and covered it with fine gold. So he's putting this beautiful cypress wood, and then he's covering the cypress wood over with pure gold. So every bit of this, can you imagine walking into a room that's basically everything except for maybe the floor is overlaid with gold and silver? Can you imagine, because it says that there were small windows where light could come in. So can you imagine as you're walking up, or you're coming into Jerusalem for one of the holy days, and you see that temple, and it says, it's almost like, well, think about it. What's that light going to do inside a gold-plated interior? It's going to brighten it up. It's no wonder they talk about the glory of the Lord. When it came in, they couldn't see. They couldn't offer up their service because they couldn't see the glory of the Lord is in there. So all of these gold-plated surfaces are like a shiny mirror. So yeah, I mean, it's very ornate, probably overdone, but that's the kind of magnificence they wanted to offer up to God. You adorned continuing on, the navy lined with cypress, covered it with fine gold and made palms and chains on it. He adorned the house with settings of precious stones. The gold was gold of Parvain. So he lined the house with gold, its beams, thresholds, its walls, and its doors, and he carved cherubim on the walls. And he made the most holy place. Its length, corresponding to the breadth of the house, was 20 cubits, and its breadth was 20 cubits. He overlaid it with 600 talents of fine gold. The weight of gold for the nails was 50 shekels, and he overlaid the upper chambers with gold. Now, see, it gives us these descriptors, and we don't know what this means when it talks about the upper chambers. What were the upper chambers? What did they look like? Where were they? Were they like balconies, enclosed balconies, or was it a second floor? What was it? We don't know. We don't know. But it's very, very, very fancy, very ornate. The most holy places, he made 2 cherubim of gold, overlaid them with gold. The wings of the cherubim together extended 20 cubits. One wing of 5 touched the wall of the house. The other wing of 5 cubits touched the wing of the other cherub. Now this cherub, one wing of 5 cubits, touched the wall of the house. So it's just this absolutely grandiose structure that he's building here, and all of it with an express purpose of giving glory to God. In front of the house, he made 2 pillars, 35 cubits high, with a capital of 5 cubits on the top of each. He made chains like a necklace and put them on the tops of the pillars, and he made 100 pomegranates and put them on the chains. He set up the pillars. Now, where do we get the chains and the pomegranates? That kind of goes into the attire of the priests, remember? There were things that they were supposed to put as ornamentation on their robes, and the chains and the pomegranates were certainly a portion of that. So he's carrying over these things that were found in the old style of worship with the tabernacle and the priest. He's bringing those over and he's putting them in the temple. All right. He set up the pillars in front of the temple, one on the south, one on the north. That south he called Jachin, and on the north, Boaz. Let's see. I know we're going fast, but I want to make sure we get all this in. In chapter 4 of 2 Chronicles 4, he talks about the temple furnishings. Again, to get into all of this just read the chapter and the absolute the magnificence that it must have been, and the amount of time. How long did it take to build the temple? Anybody know? How many years? A little bit more.
47 years.
Oh no! Yeah, no, that's not long. How many years did it take to build it? Anybody know?
Jesus say, we said I could rebuild it in 3 days.
Yeah, that would have been unthinkable. Even Herod's temple couldn't have been rebuilt in 3 days. So he couldn't have been talking about the temple, right? That wasn't it. How many years did it take? 7 years.
Second temple. So, about the rebuilding of the temple, or the first?
First time.
Second temple was done phases. So
Yeah. They even said that it was kind of the phases for the second temple. It was a extra biblical writing, but it talked about the temple, and it looked like it was done in phases. You know how sometimes you have a building that's been done, like part of it's done in one decade, and then another decade, another part of it's done. But the first temple of Solomon took first Solomon's temple took 7 years to build, and all these men building it in shifts. One of the things they did, I thought this was very interesting. All of the stone was carved at the quarry. There was no sound of stones being chipped and chiseled, and none of that was heard in the house of the Lord. It was all done at a distance and then brought in. So all of the stuff that was being done in the temple it was I wouldn't say quiet, but it was done so as not to offend the ears. They did all that work and brought them and set them in place so that it would be a place of comfort and rest and repose. Anyway, go to chapter 4 and just read all of the stuff that's going on here. One of the issues that we have to remember also is this: the plans that were given to Solomon were given to him by David. This was David's plans for the temple. One of the issues that we have to look at is, remember, as God commanded the children of Israel with the tabernacle, they did exactly what God told them to do. Didn't spare any expense, didn't shortchange God at all, did everything the way he said it was supposed to be done. And it was all done according to his plan. This was done all according to David's plan. The problem is, one of the things that God says is that you're not supposed to have any graven image. You're not supposed to make any graven image. There's an awful lot of graven images in the temple of the Lord. It goes to show, when we put human touch on it, doesn't necessarily mean that it's something that God is going to be entirely happy with.
It's a building meant to honor God. Why a cherubim with 20-foot wing?
With the tabernacle, God told him to do that. With the temple, he didn't tell them to do that. He merely said, you're going to build. See, God would have been perfectly fine if he just built a larger tent. He'd been fine with that. But again, God overlooks. He does not execute judgment on everything that they do. Same thing with David. He didn't bring down the law. He didn't bring down the long arm of the law of David on everything he did. Some things he as the scripture says, he winked at. He allowed it to happen in the pursuit of a greater thing. In much the same way with the temple.
Chuck,
Yes.
I have a question.
Yes.
Now that we've talked about this, the temple wasn't nearly as big as we seem to think of. When the Israelites, when the Jews would have to come in, they couldn't all get in there at the same time.
You're right. Yes.
So
they talk about the line of people coming to bring. You essentially have to stand in line and wait. When it's time to bring your sacrifice in, you waited, and you might be there a little while. When we talk about the idea of, you think about it on a day like, say, for example, Passover, which was the biggest, right? That was the one where everybody came for Passover. And they said at one point it could have been as many as 1 million Passover lambs sacrificed. They can't all get in there. Even in the building of Herod's temple, which was actually bigger than Solomon's, it was no way that you could get all the people in there. No. But it goes to show that it doesn't have to be big, right? It doesn't have to be ornate. God's not looking for that. God's looking for God dwelled in tents for how many years? He was perfectly fine with that. But again, I'm kind of glad that we don't have a temple as the Israelites did. I'm grateful for that. Because our temple is wherever we are. We're a temple of the Holy Spirit. God dwells with us wherever we are. His Son is with us. Where two or more gathered together, there I am also. We don't have to have a physical temple. Also, a physical temple, guess what? A physical temple can break. It can be destroyed, as was the case at least twice. We don't have to worry about that. If our physical temple is destroyed, what happens to us? What's inside, what dwells inside, goes back to be with God. So we're in far superior place. You're absolutely right. Thank you for the comment. I appreciate that. So anyway, go through chapter 4 and look and see how extravagant Solomon's temple truly was. Just an outstanding. And it was, as in a small place, he has all of this stuff in there. So you can imagine when the people would come to the temple, especially you get people that had never been to the temple. There were people who lived in Jerusalem in Jesus' time. They were in the temple all the time. Going to the temple was a common everyday occurrence. But you can imagine people who it had been a long time since they were in Jerusalem, and then they come to Jerusalem on that dedication of the temple, and they come in And as they're able to come in and see the house of the Lord, how jaw-dropping it was, how absolutely magnificent it was, and how they were just overjoyed that their God now finally had a house. And we're done. Good place to stop. Next week, we're going to get into the dedication of the temple, and that's in chapter 1 Kings 8 and 2 Chronicles 5. We're going to talk about the dedication of the temple, because this is, again, a absolutely a monumental occasion. It is a day of the Lord, because the Lord shows on that day that he is in favor of this and that his glory is going to dwell in it by his presence actually entering into the temple. So we'll talk about that next week. Thank you so much for everybody's attention.